Summer 1990. A teenage boy in trouble. An evil that only comes out at night. Only a straight-to VHS movie can save him. From A. Kale, the author of Beware the Night. Bad Dreams. A thrilling horror novel, now available on Amazon. Rated PG-13, for some thematic elements and mild violence.
You are listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.
Welcome to this new episode of the Dark Fantastic Podcast, Pocket Edition, which is a shorter episode but packed with all the things that you love about the podcast. So let's begin. I previously talked about some of the Hitchcock movies that I rediscovered recently, specifically the black and white movies that Hitchcock made in England before he came to Hollywood and made his first feature there with David O. Selznick in 1939. A somewhat underwhelming movie called Rebecca, but some people love it. I'm not really that fond of Rebecca, but I want to talk about another one of these black and white movies that Hitchcock made in England. Recently, I had a chance to rewatch his movie Murder, made in 1930, and it is one of the first sound movies made in the UK. Before that, Hitchcock had made Blackmail the previous year, 1929, and that was also a very, very interesting movie, very entertaining, and it has become one of my favorite black and white Hitchcock movies made in the UK. Murder was first released in 1930 and is an almost forgotten black and white film which Hitchcock co-wrote and directed. I'd only watched it, I think, about 10 years ago, and it didn't really leave an impression on me at the time when I watched it. Part of the reason, I think, was I was really getting into Hitchcock at the time, and I'd watched a lot of his quote-unquote classics, most of which were made in Hollywood in the 1950s. And I think coming off watching movies like Vertigo and Shadow of a Doubt and North by Northwest and The Birds, which is one of my favorites. So after watching these, flashy, big-budget Hollywood movies made by Hitchcock, which are very, very much, they feature the Hitchcock style, they are technically marvelous, and they are, they contain all the trademarks of the Hitchcock style. But after watching them, and then at the time, that was like 10 years ago, and after watching them and then going back to his, more modestly budgeted films made in the UK in the 1920s and 30s, I think those movies made in the UK suffered by comparison, to the technical razzle-dazzle of his Hollywood movies. But now, with the benefit of the time that has elapsed between watching these, big Hollywood classics and then going back now to the black and white movies, I can appreciate the movies that he made in the UK with the limited resources that he had at the time and the limited technology that was available at the time, I can now, appreciate them and really get into them for what they are, basically. And what they are, trailblazers, and they are fascinating to watch because by watching those movies, you can, clearly see the evolution of Hitchcock's style. And Murder from 1930 is a prime example of that, because it's basically, although it's basically forgotten and mainly remembered for the bit of trivia of Hitchcock having a full orchestra playing behind the camera, and the scenes where music was needed, like the scene where Sir John is shaving and he has the radio on. In that scene, there was a full orchestra playing behind the camera to be so Hitchcock and his crew could capture the sound of the radio on film, because at the time the technology didn't really allow for post-production, mixing and recording. So that bit of trivia is basically the most famous thing about Murder now in the minds of most Hitchcock fans and most movie in the minds of most movie buffs, or at least casual movie buffs. But Murder deserves much more recognition and is honestly ripe for rediscovery. It deals with one of Hitchcock's favorite themes, the wrong man. In this case, actually, it's a wrong woman who is wrongly accused and later convicted of murder. And one of the jurors who sentenced her to death, Sir John, wonderfully played by Herbert Marshall in one of his, least flashy roles and one of his most touching roles. Sir John feels guilty about going along with the rest of the jury, as he doesn't really believe she's guilty when he makes the decision to convict her, under the peer pressure of his fellow jurors. So she's sentenced to death, and right before, or a few days before, she's scheduled to be executed, he has like a crisis of conscience, or a rising and escalating crisis of conscience that's made worse by him, getting a piece of information that basically confirms or, solidifies his suspicion that that woman is not guilty, that woman was wrongly convicted. So I don't want to say any more about the plot, because the plot is very interesting. And the film was a wonderful surprise to me, because it is one of Hitchcock's most humane films, and it contains some wonderful writing by him and his co-writers, and it has some wonderful characters and performances. And Hitchcock deals with the subject matter with a gentleness and a maturity that is basically lacking in most of his later work, especially in his Hollywood features, where he sometimes took his knack for dark humor a bit too far. It also lacks Hitchcock's showy technical touches, because there are no set pieces really, with the exception of a scene at the circus at the climax of the movie, which is a very minor set piece. Visually, the film is just, it flows, and it has some terrific compositions, and the way Hitchcock's visuals and, you know, tell the story, and the way Hitchcock uses the stationary camera in that movie to tell the story, because he uses a technique that was very popular at the time, because, you know, sound was very new and the cameras were very bulky, and moving the camera while recording sound, you know, was problematic because the cameras actually made a lot of noise. So a lot of directors basically at the time just covered the scene with a stationary camera. Basically, they just panned the camera left and right, or tilted the camera on its mount up and down. But Hitchcock uses this you know, limited frame of movement with the pans and the tilts in a very clever way to keep the story going and to create this dynamic that's very interesting to watch. How you know, how he changes the compositions just by moving the camera a little bit, panning it a little bit to the right or to the left, in a way that most directors at the time didn't really, you know, use the camera in that way, in that very, you know, controlled way that Hitchcock, you know, used the camera with at the time. And it's very apparent in Murder. And of course, montage, you know, plays a huge part in the movie. He also uses a lot of editing tricks, and the editing, although a bit rough around the edges, which is typical of movies of the time, it's still, you know, there are still masterful moments in that movie. And again, Hitchcock uses a lot of tricks that he borrowed from expressionist cinema, or the expressionist cinema of the German school. And also the revelation of the killer's identity and his motive for killing another man took me by surprise. It's very tragic, and the truth about the killer and his motives, it's very timely. I don't want to, you know, ruin the ending, but when you watch the movie, you will understand what I'm talking about. But it's very tragic, it's very touching, and it's very timely. And the whole film is just warm-hearted and wonderfully realized, and it's a must for Hitchcock aficionados and fans of classic cinema. And if you want to know more about Hitchcock, especially his great British black and white movies made in the 20s and 30s, you can go back to episode 13 of this podcast, where I talk somewhat at length about a few other Hitchcock movies, like Blackmail and Downfall, also two great movies. I think that I want to finish up about Murder, but by saying that I think that the reason why I really liked Murder this time around when I watched it is that I had a chance to watch a remastered version that's out on Blu-ray. And I have to say, you know, these remastered versions of classic movies are just revelations. They are just the greatest investment you can make as a movie lover, because new movies that come out on Blu-ray, or even movies dating back to even the 50s, they look great on Blu-ray, and some of course look better than others. But the true magic of Blu-rays and these restorations really, you know, shows with movies made in the 1920s and the 1930s, because these movies were only available for the past 50 years, you know, in very battered, scratchy prints. And they did movies like Murder and a lot of black and white and silent movies they did them a huge disservice. And by watching, these movies on, again, scratchy, prints, and because all the DVDs and the VHS copies of Murder, for example, that were available were terrible. So watching it again on Blu-ray is just amazing. It's like watching a new movie, and of course, the flaws in the technology are more apparent now, but the beauty is also more apparent, and the magic of this, of this type of movie and of these old-time techniques is just they come alive now. And for a movie fan, just watching Murder on Blu-ray was amazing, and I highly recommend that you go out and track down a copy of Murder on Blu-ray. I want to briefly touch upon a movie I watched recently, and I really didn't like that movie. It's The Batman, released in this year, 2022. And I have to say that I wasn't really looking forward to it, because from the trailer, or the teaser trailer that I watched a long time ago, and from the stills that were released and the interviews that were released with Robert Pattinson and the director Matt Reeves before the film came out, they just gave me, a bad feeling about where the filmmakers would be taking the character of Batman. And honestly, when I watched it, I wasn't disappointed, or I wasn't proven wrong when it came to my suspicions. Because, as it turns out, The Batman is a movie whose purpose I don't really get. It's just miserable. It turns the Batman mythology upside down and goes against many, many things that the character of Batman and its creators stood for. It is a politically correct, dull, and downbeat movie that leaves the viewer with the overriding feeling that Batman, this version of Batman in this movie, is not really worth rooting for. It seems to be interested in, deflating Batman and defanging Batman, for lack of a better term. And it seems to basically have it in for superhero movies, although Batman isn't really a superhero. But Matt Reeves, because he's the one who's mostly to blame. He co-wrote the movie and directed the movie, and he's a very smart filmmaker, so he basically is aware of what he's doing, and he knows what he was doing when he was making it. It seems that Matt Reeves was really intent on making a political statement with the Batman and making a movie that is, for better or worse, timely and relevant, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but it's just this movie is just so politically correct, and it panders in the worst way possible. And to me, at least, it came across as the least entertaining movie ever made. Say what you will about the Batman movies of Tim Burton and Joel Schumacher, and the terrible Batman and Robin, which I had the misfortune of seeing in theaters when it came out. But even Batman and Robin, in all its silliness and in its all its overdone visuals and over the top color schemes and camp style. Even Batman and Robin was at least entertaining in a very silly way, because it didn't take itself seriously. But the Batman, starring Robert Pattinson and directed by Matt Reeves, is just a movie that it's basically a very lame, downbeat, nihilistic thriller that's, it's too long and too dark, and it just happens to feature Batman in it as a character. And the Batman in this version, he is, again, as I said, you can't root for him, and it's deliberate. The writing directs you in that way, and the dialogue directs you in that way, because they want to portray him as a very flawed kind of character, and as some kind of vigilante that you shouldn't be rooting for. And these themes, to be honest, have been dealt with before in a much better way in Frank Miller's, the Frank Miller graphic novels, like Batman Year One, for example, or the Dark Knight Returns, and even in Batman Year Two by Mike Barr. But the way Matt Reeves deals with these issues here, it's just too politicized, and it is too lame and downbeat, and I just didn't like this movie at all. As a Batman fan, as a lifelong Batman fan, I thought it was just a sorry excuse for a Batman movie, and I hated that someone would use the Batman character in such a way to make a statement that has mostly nothing to do with Batman. I, for one, will go back to Tim Burton's Batman or Christopher Nolan's rousing Dark Knight trilogy, movies that are much more interested in telling a good story than preaching and trying to basically cut Batman down to size. Or you can go read the late great Dennis O'Neill's novelization of Batman Nightfall, which is one of my favorite Batman novels. So when it comes to Batman, there's so much good stuff out there, and 2022's The Batman sure ain't one of them. I'd like to do something a bit different with the podcast, which I didn't really want to do when I started out this podcast, which is, do one of these top 10 things. But I really love the films of John Carpenter, and I miss him terribly. I miss him as a filmmaker, because he hasn't made a film in over 10 years now, since the very disappointing The Ward, which came out in 2011, I think. So I'm gonna break my own rule, and I'm gonna do one of these top 10 lists. I'm gonna talk about my top 10 favorite John Carpenter movies. So in this episode, I'm gonna touch upon the number 10 on my list, which is John Carpenter's Vampires, released in 1998. I didn't catch this one in theaters when it came out. I had to wait for it to come out on DVD, and I grabbed the copy as soon as it came out. I couldn't wait to just, unwrap it and remove the shrink wrap and just pop it into my DVD player. And I didn't even have a DVD player at the time. I think I only had a DVD-ROM, player that was attached to my PC, for those who remember these ancient things. So I popped it in and I watched it, and I remember that watching Vampires for the first time, it was such a strange experience, because it it hit me as a very different type of John Carpenter movie, because the way the opening scene was cut in a very, I'm not gonna say flashy, but kind of a quick cutting style that isn't really typical of Carpenter's work. And the music score was also very, it was like a Western cowboy score, something that he hadn't really done before, or at least in that manner. And as I watched the movie, I was just taken aback by how dark and violent and nihilistic it was, and how unlikable the characters were. Even the lead character, or especially the lead character, Jack Crow, the vampire hunter, played by James Woods, who was obviously having a great time doing that movie. But watching it, I had the feeling that, I don't know, there was something very negative about that movie. And after I finished watching it, and as I was watching the credits, I felt that it left kind of a bad taste in my mouth. But I just, left it there on my shelf, and I think I rewatched it a couple of days later, and the second time I think was a little bit better. And then I had a chance to watch it, I think, a couple more times after that, and it never really became one of my absolute favorites. But the reason why I put it on the list in the number 10 spot is that I think it is the last great John Carpenter movie, and it's also one of his riskiest and most eccentric movies. Listening to the commentary on the DVD and reading interviews with him, and I've read a lot of interviews about vampires with John Carpenter, and I've read almost every single book written about Carpenter or that features interviews with Carpenter. And after taking all that in, I think that what John Carpenter wanted to do with that movie is basically strike back at the political correctness of the 90s, for better or for worse. And he wanted to make a statement, and that's why the movie features more nudity than is usual in his movies, and a lot more gore and violence than is usual in his movies. It's a very angry movie, it's a very dark movie, and it has some, like kind of a mean streak, or a mean streak of dark humor running underneath. But it's also very misogynistic, and the way that Carpenter deals with Sheryl Lee's character, the prostitute Katrina, I think her name was, and I'm a huge fan of Sheryl Lee's work, and I think she's a brilliant actress, and she was brilliant in Vampires, and of course she's mostly known for her work with David Lynch, especially in Twin Peaks and Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. But the way he dealt with her character, the abuse that she goes through in that movie is very disturbing. But visually the movie is stunning, and it has some terrific music composed and performed by Carpenter, and a great band with him. And it features a lot of his, cornerstone themes, themes that he got from Howard Hawks and Westerns, like loyalty between partners, and the man against the machine. Basically, in this case, it's the church, and of course, anybody who watches Carpenter's movies knows that he doesn't really like organized religion, and he's an atheist, and he doesn't really. In almost all of his movies that feature a priest, the priest is always a bad guy, or someone who's very flawed as a human being, like the priest character in The Fog, and the priest character in Village of the Damned, played by Mark Hamill. That was a very over-the-top villain. And of course, the whole idea of vampires is that the church, the Catholic Church, is the bad guy, and it's actually the reason why vampires exist. It's a very messed up plot that never made any sense. And Carpenter himself admits that he doesn't really understand the plot because he adapted it from a novel called Vampires. It's a terrible novel, actually, that I couldn't even finish. So it has some of his basic themes of the church as the villain, and his problems with organized religion, and his idea of the sole hero or anti-hero that has to do the right thing. These existentialist themes that he likes. So it features his styles, it features many of his themes. So that's why I like it, because it has his fingerprints all over it, and it's visually stunning. But it is a very flawed film in many ways, and it really showed the beginnings of his decline as a filmmaker, and you could sense it while watching it, that there was this anger that was like taking over his filmmaking. So it didn't really come as a surprise to me when he quit making movies, basically. I don't know where that anger comes from exactly. He has mentioned that he had a lot of problems with studios, and he just got tired of the game, basically. But also thematically, the anger in his movies and the nihilism just kept, it became overwhelming, really. And it's a strand that has run through many of his movies, The Thing and Prince of Darkness and In the Mouth of Madness, and many of his movies, and even Escape from New York. John Carpenter himself has described Escape from New York and Escape from LA as movies that deal with nihilism, but they were always, balanced by the energy of his filmmaking and the beauty of his technique and visuals. But later on, you could feel his enthusiasm waning, and his, kind of the darkness taking over. And I think that made the movies a bit too hard to they made the movies a bitter pill to swallow, basically, not as enjoyable as his earlier work. So that's my take on Vampires, which sits on the number 10 spot on my top 10 favorite John Carpenter movies. And stick around for my number 9 in the next pocket edition of the podcast. I'd like to end this episode with a clip featuring the late, great Vangelis, who passed away recently. In this clip, he basically improvises this terrific piece of music for a show. I think that show, I think it was a Greek TV show. And he just, this clip shows him, sitting behind his gear, some scary-looking synthesizers, and just improvising this brilliant piece of music. And this was around the time he made the Blade Runner soundtrack, one of his most famous works, and a brilliant piece of work. So the sound of this piece that he improvises is very reminiscent of his work on Blade Runner. So I want to end this episode with this piece of music, and as a tribute to Vangelis. And again, thank you for joining me on this episode of the Dark Fantastic podcast. And please join me again.
You've been listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.